We've got another interesting story to share with you, so let's begin. My name is Harvey, and this is the story of how a single joke destroyed my marriage. I was married to Susan, a woman I once thought I would spend forever with. From the very beginning, we both knew we wanted kids. Even before we got engaged, we'd sit for hours talking about what our future would look like, how many kids we'd have, what their names would be, who they'd take after. We imagined a big family, noisy dinner tables, and messy playrooms filled with toys. I could already see myself teaching my son how to ride a bike or reading bedtime stories to my daughter. Susan loved kids too. She talked about them with so much excitement. She would show me videos of cute toddlers saying, "One day, that will be us." When we finally got married, we didn't want to wait. We had spent years talking about the kind of family we wanted. So, as soon as we said our vows, we started trying for a baby. At first, it was exciting. Every month felt like a fresh start, a new opportunity. We turned it into a little game, playfully guessing whether we'd have a boy or a girl first. Susan would bring home baby name books, and we'd sit together, imagining what our child would look like, whose features they'd inherit, and what kind of parents we would be. But the months passed, and nothing happened. We shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe it was just a matter of time. People always say, "Don't stress about it. It'll happen when you least expect it." So we took a more relaxed approach, telling ourselves it would happen when the time was right. But as months turned into a year, and then into two, the excitement started to fade. The game we used to play turned into silent hope, and then into unspoken disappointment. Every negative pregnancy test became harder to ignore, and every month felt heavier than the last. By the beginning of the third year, the doubt had settled in like a weight on our shoulders. We stopped talking about nursery plans. The baby name books were shoved to the back of a shelf, forgotten. Susan tried to act like she wasn't worried, but I could see it in her eyes. Conversations about children that used to make her smile now made her uncomfortable, and she would change the subject or force a tight-lipped response. We couldn't ignore it anymore. Something wasn't right. So, after 3 long years of waiting, of hoping, of pretending that time would somehow fix everything, we finally decided to get checked. The tests were simple, just routine blood work and a few other things. We waited anxiously for the results, hoping for some small issue, something that could be easily fixed. But when the doctor finally sat us down, his words felt like a punch to the gut. "Harvey, your sperm count is extremely low. Right now, it's nearly impossible for you to conceive naturally." I remember just sitting there, numb, unable to process what he had just said. My heart was pounding. Susan was beside me, staring straight ahead. She didn't say a word. The doctor kept talking, explaining that I wasn't completely infertile. There was still a small chance. He suggested boosters, a strict diet, and regular exercise to improve my fertility. But all I could hear was the one part that mattered. I wasn't able to give Susan the family we had dreamed of. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling like my whole world had collapsed. I had failed as a husband. What kind of man couldn't even give his wife a child? Susan told me she wasn't going anywhere. She held my hand and said, "We'll figure this out together." But as the days passed, her actions said something completely different. She started avoiding conversations about babies. When friends talked about pregnancy or showed off pictures of their kids, she would suddenly change the subject or walk away. I don't see anything wrong with avoiding things like that, but the challenge is that when something like this happens, she holds the anger for days and sometimes weeks and keeps transferring passive aggression to me. At first, I thought she was just trying to process everything like I was. But then, the little jabs started. "I just don't get it. How can 2 healthy people struggle to conceive?" She once said out of the blue over dinner, shaking her head. Maybe if we had started earlier, things would be different. They were small comments, thrown casually into conversation, but each one cut deeper than the last. I feared she would leave me. At first, it was just a passing thought. But over time, it became an obsession, something that sat in the back of my mind from the moment I woke up until the moment I forced myself to sleep. I tried to ignore it, convince myself that I was overthinking. But the signs were everywhere. Susan wasn't the same. She started coming home late, always with some excuse. I grabbed dinner with the girls, or I just needed to clear my head. At first I believed her. But then it became a pattern. She spent more and more time outside, barely speaking to me when she was home. She used to kiss me goodnight and used to fall asleep with her head on my chest. Now, she barely looked at me. The warmth in her eyes was gone. One night I finally asked, "Susan, are we okay?" She sighed, rubbing her forehead like the conversation itself was exhausting. "I don't know, Harvey. I just wish things were different." That broke me. I had done everything I could. I took the boosters, changed my diet, and exercised every day. I followed every piece of advice the doctor gave me. But no matter what I did, I couldn't fix us. The silence in our home grew louder. Some nights, I'd sit in the living room, staring at the pictures on the wall, the ones where we looked happy, where we still had hope. Now, the house didn't feel like home. It felt like a waiting room for the inevitable. And every time Susan opened her mouth, I braced myself. Because I knew another jab was coming. It's just frustrating, seeing everyone else move forward while we're stuck. Maybe we weren't meant to have kids together. She never yelled, never outright blamed me. But her words sliced me open in ways no argument ever could. I wanted to believe she was just hurting, that this was her way of dealing with it. But deep down, I knew she was already halfway out the door. Susan and I attended a small gathering at a friend's house one evening. It was a casual backyard get-together, nothing extravagant, just familiar faces, music, and conversations over drinks. I wasn't particularly in the mood to socialize, but Susan was enjoying herself, drinking more than usual, and laughing a little too loudly. I sat back, observing and enjoying the vibe of the evening. At some point, the conversation shifted to children. A couple at the party had just announced their pregnancy, and the group erupted in excitement, offering congratulations and sharing parenting advice. It was a conversation I had grown used to avoiding. But then someone directed the question at us. "So, when are you two finally giving us a baby to spoil?" The words were innocent, said in a light-hearted tone, but they felt heavier than they should have. Susan laughed. Then, without hesitation, she spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Harvey? Oh, please, he's not even man enough to get me pregnant." A thick silence followed. The laughter stopped. Conversations died. A few people glanced at me uncomfortably, while others awkwardly pretended they hadn't heard. But I had. And there was no pretending this away. I didn't react. I didn't argue, didn't tell her to stop, didn't ask her why she would humiliate me like that in front of people we both knew. I simply stood up and walked away. I wasn't angry at that moment. I was done. There was nothing left to fight for. When I got home, I walked straight to our bedroom, pulled out a duffel bag, and started packing. I took only the essentials, clothes, my wallet, toiletries. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew I wasn't staying. After zipping up the bag, I took one last look around before stepping out of the house that had once felt like home but now felt like a cage. I checked into a hotel across town and turned off my phone. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension, no forced small talk, no second-guessing every word that left my mouth. Just silence. And for once, the silence felt peaceful. When I finally turned my phone back on the next morning, I was met with a flood of messages. Friends who had witnessed what happened had texted, asking if I was okay, and offering to talk. Then there were Susan's messages. One from last night, asking where I was. Another from that morning. "Are you hurt because of what I said?" It was just the drink. I stared at the screen, reading her words over and over. There was no apology, no remorse, just an excuse. I didn't respond. And when she realized I wasn't going to, she didn't bother texting again. A few days after I left, Susan finally saw the letter I had written and left it on her dresser that night. It read, "I stayed through everything. The fights, the the disrespect. But if even my greatest pain is a joke to you, then I have no place here. The text she sent me told me she read it. I don't know what she felt when she read it, but I do know one thing. She hadn't expected me to really leave. Maybe she assumed I was just angry and needed space, that I would be gone for a few days or a week at most before coming back like nothing happened. But after reading that letter, she must have realized just how serious my leaving was. At first, I thought she had seen it and ignored it. I didn't hear from her the first day or the next. But then, she started reaching out, calling, and sending messages, asking me to meet her so we could talk. I didn't respond. I had nothing left to say. But her persistence didn't stop. The intensity of her calls and messages over the following days made it clear. She was finally understanding that I was gone for good. Her messages became more frequent. Her calls didn't stop. When I didn't answer, she started reaching out to mutual friends, asking them to talk to me, to convince me to come home. But I had made my decision, and I wasn't going back. Then, about a week after she started reaching out, she received the divorce papers. That was my final answer. I wasn't going to argue, plead, or fight anymore. I was done. I didn't owe her any more explanations. After leaving, I moved to a new city and started over. It wasn't easy at first, adjusting to life alone, rebuilding myself from the ground up. But in time, I found peace. I learned to enjoy my own company, to let go of the pain I carried for so long. More importantly, I learned that I was more than my ability to have children. Then I met Naomi. She was different. Kind, supportive, and understanding. We took things slow, and for the first time in years, I felt truly wanted. A year into my relationship with Naomi, she sat me down one evening with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something in her eyes, excitement, nervousness, maybe even a little fear. Then she said it. "Harvey, I'm pregnant." The moment the words left her mouth, my mind scrambled to process what I had just heard. At first, I let out a small laugh, assuming she was joking. But when she didn't smile, when she just sat there waiting for my response, the amusement disappeared, and confusion took its place. I stared at her, trying to make sense of it. Pregnant? How? That was the only thought that ran through my head. I shook my head almost instinctively. That's not possible. My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I couldn't help it. Out of nowhere, Naomi was telling me she was pregnant. My mind jumped to the only explanation that made sense to me at the time. She had to be cheating. I remember the way her face twisted with hurt when I accused her. She was offended, but she didn't yell or cry. Instead, she calmly told me that she hadn't been with any other man. She was sure that I was the father, 100% sure. But I wasn't about to take any chances. I had been through too much to just blindly accept something that didn't seem possible. I insisted on a paternity test. Naomi didn't hesitate. She agreed right away, telling me I could do whatever I needed to feel at ease. Still, as we waited for the results, I felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. If the test came back and confirmed my fears, it would shatter me. But if by some miracle it proved I was the father, then what? When the results finally came in, I felt my whole world tilt. I was the father. I must have read those words a dozen times, but they didn't feel real. I sat there in shock, my hands gripping the paper, trying to understand how this was even possible. The doctors had been so certain before. My sperm count had been too low, my chances close to nothing. And yet, here was living proof that something had changed. I booked an appointment at a fertility clinic the very next day. I needed answers. I needed to know if this was a one-time miracle or if something inside me had truly changed. The tests confirmed what I had once thought impossible. My fertility had improved significantly. Whether it was the lifestyle changes I had kept up over the years, the passage of time, or something science couldn't quite explain, my body had done what I thought it never could. I was no longer infertile. The irony wasn't lost on me. If Susan, my ex-wife, had just been patient, If she had held on a little longer instead of letting her frustration push me away, we could have had the family we always dreamed of. But standing there looking at Naomi, I realized I had no regrets. My past marriage had been built on pressure, disappointment, and unspoken resentment. But with Naomi, things were different. She loved me without conditions, without expectations. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. I have no idea what happened to my ex-wife, Susan, after I left. I never reached out, and she never tried to find me. Maybe she moved on and had children, maybe she regretted everything. Or maybe she convinced herself that she had done nothing wrong. I don't know, and to be honest, I don't care anymore. Some things don't need to be revisited. Some doors are meant to stay closed. I'm not bitter about the past. In fact, I'm grateful. Life gave me a second chance. I found someone who values me for who I am, not for what I can or cannot give. She stood by me without conditions, without passive-aggressive remarks, without making me feel like I was never enough. Looking back, I see things clearly now. Love isn't just about being together when things are good. It's about staying when things get hard, about patience, about choosing kindness even in frustration. Susan had the choice to stand with me, to be my partner in the struggle, but she chose to humiliate me instead. And that's the kind of thing you can't take back. Words leave scars, and the ones said by the person you trust the most cut the deepest. If there's one thing I hope people take from my story, it's this: patience and respect matter. If you truly love someone, you don't throw their pain back in their face, no matter how frustrated you are. You don't humiliate them, especially not in front of others. And you don't let your temporary emotions ruin something that could have been beautiful. But in the end, I'm glad things turned out the way they did because I ended up with someone who truly loves me for me. That's the story, folks. I hope you take something from it. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Do you think Susan deserved another chance, or was walking away the only option? And if you know someone who needs to hear this, make sure you share it with them. Until next time, take care.